Good morning. Let me read to you the gospel text for today. It's from Matthew 5 and verses 38 to 45. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I, Jesus, say to you, do not use violence when resisting an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your God in heaven. For God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. May these words be to us our light and our life. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to the youth choir. Oh, they're gone. No, they're not. Here they are. They're here. They just aged really rapidly in the last... I was going to thank the youth choir. It was like sitting among angels and being put in a very peaceful place. They were great. So I want to talk to you about this passage, but I want to start out by acknowledging something that I think we rarely do. It's I call it the great paradox. Jesus teaches love of enemies. He calls us to be peacemakers. He models nonviolence. 84% of U.S. adults identify themselves as Christian. And we live in the most militarized country in the history of the world. That's our paradox. How does that happen? Why does that happen? So that's the question I want to wrestle with this morning. And I want to put into context Jesus' words about loving enemies, and also his modeling of a nonviolent practice in the midst of this passage that I read. So how do we frame that? So 2 important pieces of context. One would be that Jesus lives in the context of Roman imperialism. The Roman Empire is controlling and dominating his world. And the other is the broader narrative in the story of Israel, and how central to that narrative violence was to hope. Now that's another thing that we don't often talk about. Very quickly, my assessment would be that there are 3 basic storylines that kind of dominate the history of Israel and the biblical story around that history. Despite what you might think, the Israelites saw themselves as being chosen, but things didn't go very well for them in history. One of the stories promised that it would. It was the story of the Exodus, and the Exodus was understood as a liberating story where God's violence freed the people from oppression. That's a very early and powerful story for the people. It's a story about liberating violence. But as history went on, the people of Israel were driven from the land, sent into exile, dominated by one foreign power after another. And as a result, a new story emerges, and it's the story of the punishing violence of God. We had this happen to us because of our sin, because we did something wrong. And usually that story came with a promise of the possibility of a historical reversal. If the people just behaved properly, if they worshiped in the right way, if they were more just, if they did X, Y, and Z, God's favor would be on their side and they would be saved. Understood as the crushing defeat of our enemy. That's the meaning of salvation. But in actual history, the reversal didn't take place. In fact, for the people of Israel, things got worse. And so about 175 years before Jesus is born, a new ruler comes to power, Antiochus, a Seleucid leader, roughly the Greek Empire, and he outlaws the Jewish religion, and he says, anybody who practices their religion, I will have killed. And he does. He kills many. And in this context of horrible suffering, and hopelessness, a new worldview emerges in the narrative, and it's the story of God's vindicating violence at the end of history that is to come very soon. God doesn't want us to be suffering this way, but God is fighting a cosmic battle against the forces of evil in heaven, and the good news is God is winning that battle, and soon will come, and our enemies will fry, and we will be resurrected, and everything will be great, the story said. Well, those are the three dominant storylines, and these storylines also frame what's going on in first century Palestine, and now they're under Roman rule, just a brutal dictatorship imposed on the people of Palestine. And in this context, Rome ruled through four primary means. The first was ideology. We're Rome, and our violence holds the world together. Without Roman violence, the whole world would be chaos. And secondly, they ruled through client kings. They appointed people like Herod the Great to rule on their behalf, to make sure the taxes flowed to Rome, to make sure that there was no social uprising that would succeed in challenging Roman power. And the third way that they ruled was through the temple elite. The religious leaders were complicit in this overwhelming domination system in which the vast majority of people were living in despair. And finally, when that didn't work, and if there were rebellions, and there were right around the time of Jesus' birth, major rebellions throughout Palestine, and the Romans sent in their soldiers and crushed them. And they crucified thousands of people and left their bodies in public places as a sign that you don't mess with Rome. All of this is a context, and we hear Jesus talking about love of enemies and turning the other cheek and walking the extra mile. People in first century Palestine would have been asking themselves two questions. What did we do to offend God? Because God is doing this to us in response to our unfaithfulness. And what could we do differently to trigger God's favor so that God's power would be on our side and we could get rid of these Romans and get rid of this temple establishment and throw out this client king ruler? Those are the questions they asked, and they rooted their hope in two places, two possibilities. One was that God would send them a military Messiah who would join forces with them to throw out the Romans and cleanse the temple. But after rebellion crushed the people and crucified thousands, they didn't really find much hope there. And so the ascendant worldview is that apocalyptic worldview. And we should remember this in our own context, in our own nation, in our own world, that bad news is always good news for the apocalyptic worldview. This idea that things may not change, but the world is going to end soon, and our side, we're going to be vindicated, and all of our enemies are going to be on the outside, and they'll get what they deserve. It's a very tempting message. Jesus' contemporaries offered various solutions or offered various explanations for what could happen. The Sadducees, they collaborated with the Roman rule and said, we're going to stake our claim with the Romans. That's how we're going to do okay. The Pharisees said, no, we just got to be pure. We've just got to be individually pious. We better not have gay marriage or other things. Well, I'm extrapolating into the present. But you get the idea. They said, no, personal piety, that will please God, and then God's favor will be on our side. The Sicarii had a different answer. They went around assassinating religious leaders that were complicit in Roman rule. They were terrorists. That was their response. The Zealots planned an armed revolutionary movement to try to oust the Romans. John the Baptist and the Essenes were apocalyptic. They were announcing the imminent end of the world. And the Essenes, very interesting in light of this passage, love enemies, the Essenes specifically taught their foundational message was the hatred of enemies. The hatred of enemies would be the driving force. It would recruit only males and really well-positioned males to fight this final battle on God's behalf to usher in the apocalyptic end of the world. And then you have Jesus. Now, I got to be honest here and say that in the biblical story, we meet many different Jesuses, and they're all incompatible. They can't all be true. But there's a stream in this tradition that I drew on today, and it's a stream in which we see Jesus teaching love of enemies and modeling nonviolence, in which Jesus calls the people to be peacemakers. It's a really radical message in this context. Jesus says to the people, Roman imperialism isn't a punishment from God. It's just the context in which we are called to be faithful to a compassionate God. Jesus says, don't put your hope in the fantasy freedoms of a military Messiah or the apocalyptic end. Live each day in the compassion of God. Accept each day the invitational presence of God, inviting us to live authentic lives in the midst of whatever situations we find ourselves. Jesus says, real hope is to be cultivated and seen in the new community that roots itself in empathy and compassion and love and nonviolence and peacemaking. And yes, even love of enemies. Now, what does this mean for us? Here we are, and many of you might be offended by this, but I would say we are living in the most militarized country in the history of the world. The United States accounts for nearly half of all world military spending. We have more than 1,000 foreign military bases. We dominate the skies, we dominate space, we dominate the seas, we dominate the land. Militarily, there is no nation in the world that does or ever has compares to the military power of the United States that is exercised routinely worldwide. And what's ironic is that militarism now has become a belief system. Perhaps the real religion in the world, as my New Testament professor Walter Wink taught me years ago, is really violence. Because so many people believe that violence is useful, that violence saves, that if you got a problem, there's a military solution. What I see in our country today is that the two dominant values of American life are American exceptionalism, very similar to Roman claims that the whole world would fall apart except for us, thereby we have more responsibilities, but we also get a lot of leeway to do things that no other nation would ever be allowed to do. Double standards that infuriate the world, but that we don't even notice for the most part, because we are engulfed in this militarized culture. And the second belief system is, as I said, it's that many of us believe in the usefulness of military power. And yet what we see around the world, in my view, is the United States doing the equivalent of walking around with a baseball bat and smashing hornets' nests. And we smash a hornet's nest, and then all hell breaks loose, and it doesn't go very well. And then we interpret that as a reason to smash more nests, and to spend more money, and to intervene differently, and to do X, Y, and Z, but it's all coming from a militarized mindset. And so we're not able to even remember the words of a Republican president whose last speech to the country warned the nation of the military-industrial complex, saying to us, our democracy was in trouble, and that even our war spending levels and the wars we would fight were being disconnected from real security needs in order to serve certain interests. But as I say, I think for many of us who are in this culture, it's like smog. If you live in it and live in it and live in it and live in it, you don't really notice it. But if you were coming from the outside looking in, you would say, oh my gosh, look at this smog. That's the situation that we find ourselves in. So what are we to do? Well, I would start by saying, how about this? How about as people of faith, we decide that we're going to take Jesus seriously when he calls us to be peacemakers. We are facing, in my view, a planetary emergency around climate, around inequality, around poverty, and around militarism. The Christian churches have an opportunity and an obligation to cultivate peacemaking at all levels of society. If we were to take the nonviolent example of Jesus seriously, Jesus lived in a context where people were humiliated with backhand slaps. And he says, what should you do? Hold your ground. Stand. Be prideful. Don't be intimidated. Jesus says, lived in a time when the courts were under the control of the rich, The courts, the people would have to sell their land. They'd have to sell their families into slavery. They had nothing left. And Jesus says, you know, they've already done that to you. So now when they take you to the court and they want to sue you for your outer garment, then give them your underwear and stand naked before the court and shame the court. Because in Israeli society or in Palestinian society, it was shameful to look upon the naked, not to be naked. And Jesus says, when the Roman soldiers come through and they demand to carry your pack, and they're limited by law to only forcing you to carry their pack for a mile, keep walking. Keep walking. Throw them off balance. Because that will get them in trouble. It's creative civil disobedience in a Roman context. So how about if we just take Jesus' call to be peacemakers seriously? Now, those of you who are at the Adult Forum know that I believe this is a very, very serious time for our country and the world. I do believe that we face a planetary emergency. I also believe we have tremendous possibilities if we shift resources away from militarization and war. Let me give you just a couple of examples. Minnesota taxpayers have spent $40 billion just for our share of Iraq and Afghanistan. $40 billion. Imagine the quality of life that could exist in our towns and cities. That's not counting the fact that the U.S. military base budget has doubled since the events of September 2001. Last year, Congress devoted 59 cents out of every dollar it voted went to war. And that's not counting the support for veterans, which I'm sure many of you would say that we need to honor. But we have tremendous possibilities to transform our world if we have different values, different priorities. And what a great place to start than these passages coming from Jesus, inviting us to live authentic lives rooted in compassion and hope and nonviolence and the vision and mission of peacemaking. Amen.